Charles Manski, Board of Trustees Professor of Economics at Northwestern University. Thank you for joining us. Let's first talk about your field. How would you describe your field of research?
Well, mainly econometrics, which is empirical methodology for doing economic research. But it goes well beyond that. I do econometric theory. I do applied econometrics. I study particular policy problems, and then I've moved into decision analysis.
So, what were the central questions? What were the central questions that your field tackles with respect to decision making or uncertainty?
Well, the questions they're inferential questions. What do we really know about the world? And decision makers face problems, and we start off with most economists think about deterministic decision problems, no uncertainty at all. When economists do think about uncertainty, they typically assume setting of decision making under risk, where there are known objective probability distributions. Everyone has that knowledge. There's the term rational expectations that economists use to say that you know the objectively correct distribution. But in the work that interests me is when we have less knowledge than that. And it's just not credible to think that people have the kinds of information that's assumed in economic modeling. And decision makers face greater uncertainty, deeper, more severe uncertainty, ambiguity, whatever term you want to use, than economists typically assume.
Well, given we've got there, let's turn to the normative question of how potentially deep uncertainty or ambiguity could be dealt with in decision making or reflected in it. And let's first just talk about the general attitude in your field to this sort of question. Is the field quite united around the general attitude? Is there a range of methods? Would you say there's a generally accepted reply in the field?
So it depends what one means by the field. The prevalent view, which is not my own, which is that if there are things that are unknown, then you take whatever data that you have and make strong enough assumptions that you can get point estimates of whatever it is that you don't know. And it's particularly talking about what econometricians do. Then you plug in the estimate and then act as if the estimate is the truth, and then you go about decision making using the estimate. Now, having enough information that you can get a point estimate of something, that requires lots and lots of assumptions. When the only real competitor to that view in kind of the mainstream field to getting an estimate and plugging it in is to take a Bayesian view, so that if you don't know something, then you put you start off with a prior, and then you get some data, then you go to a posterior distribution, and then you use the posterior distribution in decision making, and it's standard expected utility maximization, subjective expected utility maximization. So those are the, I would say, the two main views out there. The former view is what goes on in most applied economics, empirical work. The latter view, the Bayesian view, is what really dominates applied economic theory, as opposed to empirical research. While theorists basically assume that everyone's Bayesian and they just build theoretical models around that, in empirical research there's actually fairly little Bayesian work that's done. It's mostly of that former type of getting an estimate of something and plugging it in. Now, I don't do either of those, but you asked about the field. So that's
I did ask about the field,
yeah.
But this is probably a good moment to talk about what you do then. What your opinion on the field is, and about the general issue of decision making under uncertainty representation.
Well, what's bugged me for a long time, I think it actually goes throughout my entire career, is that I worry about empirical analysis that is based on assumptions that don't have much foundation or justification. There's a people often say, and in fact, we heard it this morning, that all models are wrong, but some models may be useful. Actually, I find that people use that as an excuse to use silly models and to say, well, we have to choose a model and go with it and do the best we can. And the view is that you have to go with some model just as a pragmatic matter, and we'll use our point estimates based on that model. And I began asking quite a long time ago, back in the late 1980s, why? Why do you have to choose one model? Maybe the information that you have available really isn't sufficient for it to be sensible to choose one model and go with it. Maybe there's a set of models, all of which are consistent with the data, and you really can't distinguish among them. So if we make decisions, then maybe we should make decisions in a kind of forthright, transparent way, saying we just don't know which of these models is right. So that's what leads to what in econometrics is now called the field of partial identification. The standard setup is one in which you make strong enough assumptions that you can get point estimates that you can pin down at least the samples, leaving aside statistical imprecision, that you can pin down what the truth is. What I've decided quite a while ago is that may not be credible. So why not just maybe admit in some cases, or many, I think actually in most cases, that we don't have enough information to do that. Now the reasons why we don't have enough information come from multiple sources. If you're thinking about macroeconomics, there are different models of how I don't do macroeconomics, but these issues obviously arise there. There are different models of how the economy operates. Macroeconomists have debated one another for 100 years about what's the right model of the economy. There may be progress made, but if, in 2017, there's still there is no consensus about what the right macro model is. My own work's more in microeconomics. And there, the questions are about modeling choice behavior at the individual level. And so to put it in a very specific context, a quite important one, there's a huge body of work on the effect of income tax policy on labor supply. Okay, so just to make this very concrete. It goes back almost 100 years ago. Labor economists and public economists began to realize that you could not forecast effective tax policy on labor supply behavior just on theoretical grounds, because economic theory just doesn't say that much. It says that people prefer to consume more and to have more leisure. But how people would make the trade-off in terms of what their, the preference structure is, the theory doesn't say that. And the particular, kind of structure of the utility function, how people weight consumption and leisure, will have enormous impact on how people respond to differences in tax policy, including if you raise taxes. It's well known in an undergraduate labor economics book that if you raise taxes, well, maybe people will work less or maybe people will work more. It all depends on the structure of the utility function. So there's been literally 100 years of empirical research trying to nail this down. Empirically, how do people make decisions? The work really got going from the 1960s when micro data sets became available. Since then, there's been hundreds, thousands, I would say, of empirical research papers. And to this date, there's still no consensus on this. Why is there no consensus? It's because the data that we can't look into people's heads. The data that we have are the choices that people make under existing tax policy, and you don't get to observe very much. I can observe how much a particular person is working with the existing tax structure, but I don't observe what they would have done under other tax structures. So and you're trying to use that very limited data to make inference on the decision rules that people have, and there isn't that much to go on. So the literature would just say, well, we got limited data, so we'll just use some very strong parametric models that assume utility functions have particular shapes, and we'll estimate a couple of parameters and go with it. I've always felt uncomfortable with that. And I would rather say, well, we just have limited knowledge. You could try to characterize what aspects of behavior in which there is a consensus. Economists typically summarize this question of labor supply and tax policy by a single number and elasticity of response. And you can say, well, we may not be able to pin down that elasticity, but maybe we can get a bound on the elasticity. It's more complicated than that, but that catches the idea. And then we could look at formulate public policy, based on that more limited information. So that's a problem of decision under ambiguity or deep uncertainty.
Could you talk about any other examples from your research in which you meet these sorts of issues?
A very large part of what microeconomists study empirically is now been encapsulated under an old medical term, which is analysis of treatment response. So when we think about we think about a treatment, of course, you can think of it as a medical treatment. That's the origins of it, but that language has crept in. So we now think of policies as treatments. So, for example, a tax policy is a treatment. An educational policy, class size is a treatment. It's just, it's a language, it's just a general language that covers everything. And so we have a very large literature on analysis of treatment response. And this is not just in economics, of course. It does encompass what goes on in medical research and sociology all across the social sciences, study analysis of treatment response. And the general objective of that literature is to learn how the treatment that a person receives affects some outcome of interest. Okay, so it could be labor supply is the outcome of interest for the tax policy. It could be, does a patient live or die is the outcome of interest in medical treatment. In education, it could be how much does a student learn with different kinds of classroom structure and so on. So the prevalent practice has been, since we face a severe identification problem. You get to observe in past data what happened to people with the treatments that they actually received. You don't get to observe counterfactual responses, what would have happened to people if they had received different treatments. And so that's just inherently unobservable, right? You can't replay history and say what would have happened to a person if if they had had a different past history. It's just, you can't do it, just as a matter of logic. So all analysis of treatment response has to somehow deal with this problem that you don't observe counterfactuals. But if you want to predict treatment response in different circumstances, you need to predict the counterfactuals. So what happens is that people make assumptions. Okay, so we have very the most prevalent assumption, just doing analysis under the with what we call observational data, just observations coming from the real world, is to act as if treatment assignment was random, as if it would be in a randomized experiment. And people have done that for a long, long time, but then the assumption always gets beat up because it's, if you think about actual empirical situations, it's not plausible to act, very often to think the treatments are quasi-random in that sense. So in the labor economists, public economics, applied econometricians rebelled against that in the 1970s, and so they developed alternative models with different assumptions that became known as selection models, treatment selection models. And these were very tight parametric models that got away from the assumption that treatment was random, but the treatment was very purposeful, which is more congenial to an economist. Someone's actually making these decisions. Sometimes it's the person himself or the parent or the doctor or whoever it is, and then try to actually model that process. And those models were then strong enough to get point estimates of treatment effects, right? So the commonality was that you're going to make some assumption that was going to give you, that was going to be strong enough to get a point estimate of, say, an average treatment effect. When I began to think about this about in 1990, at least my first published paper was in 1990 on this, it's rare to be able to believe those assumptions. So I asked, well, what can we learn about treatment response if we don't make strong assumptions. And I actually went all the way over to the other extreme and said, well, what can we learn about treatment response? This is my starting point. What can we learn about treatment response if we begin by saying we know nothing about the counterfactuals at all? It's missing data and they could take any value. Well, even in that case, since we do observe what happened to people for the treatments they actually received, you can learn something. You can get a bound on an average treatment effect. So that goes 1990 American Economic Review, the very first paper I wrote. But that's a wide bound, and it has a very simple algebraic form, so it's very clean. But it's not very. But people may not find it very. People would say it's not very useful because the bound is wide, and they say, well, the bound is wide because we haven't assumed anything, and that's a necessary trade-off. Then what happens in the literature in which I work is then we try to explore what we call the identifying power of different assumptions. You say, well, if you start off assuming nothing about the counterfactuals, you'll get this bound. You say, well, what can you assume about the nature of counterfactuals that would be believable? It's not just an assumption of convenience, but it's believable, and then maybe you can narrow the bounds, okay? And if you assume more, then you can narrow the bounds further. Now, I don't know if I should do this to you, but I will. In listening to your own talk yesterday afternoon, where you talk about different degrees of confidence and smaller sets or larger sets of distributions, that's actually formally precisely what goes on in the mathematical kinds, in the partial identification literature. That's precisely what goes on. Is what we do is, and there's a word that I've used in several papers about layering on assumptions. And the most credible situation is the one in which you make the weakest assumptions. We'll have to have some starting point. If you make the weakest assumptions, then it's going to have very high credibility, and in your term, Brian, it would be the highest confidence. I would call it the highest credibility, and you would call it the highest confidence, but I think it means the same thing. But then you're going to get a large distribution of possible a large set of possible predictions. If you start making some assumptions, then you narrow things down. And if you just think about, you're going to get bounds on an average treatment effect, to make this very concrete. With a very weak assumption, it's a wide bound, but one with high confidence. Okay. If you start adding some assumption that you say, yeah, that's an assumption I'm willing to maintain, and I could give examples. Economists particularly use assumptions of so-called instrumental variables and other things that often are thought to have high credibility. Then I might be able to say, with moderate to high confidence, I can get a narrower bound. But then say if I make a yet stronger assumption that I feel less comfortable with, then I'll narrow it further. And then if I make a really very strong assumption, I'll narrow it to a point, which would be, in your terms, a precise probability distribution. So it actually is this ordering of confidence levels translates that you talked about yesterday, translates in my work to ordering of strength of assumptions.
How do you decide which level of strength of assumptions to use in a particular decision?
I'd like to separate two questions. One is, what would you use for decision making, and the second is, what would you use for scientific reporting? And it's easier for me to answer the second question, and I've taken a strong stance in print on this very often, which is that the writer of a piece of original research should not say, I'm going to go with just one assumption and and just do that, but really should present a range of results under weaker and stronger assumptions, and then leave it to the reader of the journal article to say to pick and choose depending on how they view the different things. So I could go back, the earliest papers I wrote on this that do this very explicitly were both in 1997. One, it was a very applied context. One on the effect of criminal sentencing on recidivism, and the lack of observability. The counterfactual is if you had given a harsher or a more lenient sentence to a criminal, what would have happened in terms of subsequent criminality. And we start off, in the published paper, I start off first with the very weak assumptions and get a wide bounds on the effect of sentencing on recidivism, but then say, well, but let's try this assumption, which has a lot of which most criminologists think is plausible, and then we see how much that narrows the bound, and then we layer on your further assumptions. So then we present a whole range. You can't obviously, in one journal article, think through every possible case, but we'll take a kind of a set of cases that go from weak assumptions to strong assumption. And I did that on a question on educational policy in a different article in that same year. So for scientific reporting, I've argued strenuously, and this is not followed up on often, but I still think it's the right thing to do. Well, you might. Some people do. I do get my papers published. Is that the researcher should not say, here's my model, take it or leave it, all right? That the researcher can provide a service by presenting a range of tighter and weaker results under stronger and weaker assumptions. And that's for scientific reporting, and I feel very comfortable about that. For the actual decision making, I think it's much harder. And the way I thought about it has been in a more binary way. I'll say, these are the assumptions I'll use, here's what I will learn, and then I will look at decision making under those assumptions. The alternative view that I'll say that you were expressing yesterday, of somehow formally in the decision having a decision process that uses the whole range from weaker assumptions to stronger assumptions. You put the phrase of that which one you should do would depend on the stakes. I wasn't exactly sure how to interpret the stakes, but at least to think that was actually a new idea to me. Sorry, you can. You can take that out if you want, but no. But it actually was a new idea. Try to figure out how to formalize that. I'm not sure at this point how I would do it. But I can't say my reveal preference. What I have done is to take a stand on and say, in this particular context, here's the assumptions I feel are credible. Yes, no. Is credible not? And this is what I'll run with to do the formal decision analysis. Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about the sorts of important, severe uncertainty decisions that we've mentioned previously, or that you've mentioned. I'd like you. I'm interested to know what sort of general practical advice you would give if you had the ear of a policymaker who actually would pay attention to what you said for 5 minutes. What are the most important things you would say to him or her?
Well, I would really have to emphasize facing up to uncertainty and not to hiding it, not to obscuring it. Before we get into any particular decision criteria, just to recognize it, there's a term that I've used in my writing, the more broad audience writing I've done. I've used a term that what I really like to avoid is policy analysis or policy making with incredible certitude. That's the term I made up. At least I couldn't find it on Google, so I'll say I made it up. Incredible certitude basically means acting as if you're sure of things when you're really not. And I see this as a pervasive illness among my fellow economists and among policymakers, that they want to say, this is the view that will never, forget deep uncertainty. They don't even want to think about objective probability distributions. They just want to say, this is it. This is the number, right? So for climate change, they were going to say, the temperature will go up by exactly 2.3 degrees centigrade or something like that. The example that I often use is the Congressional Budget Office in the United States that makes point predictions of the implications for the federal deficit of extremely complex types of legislation. And they'll say, we're going to save $138 billion, which is what they said Obamacare would save. Exactly $138 billion. So I would say to the policymaker, don't do that. And they say, well, you know, we have to have, it's a good summary statistic. And I say, no, it's very dangerous, because if you act as if things are certain, then there are entire modes of decision making that you won't think of, okay? And one certainly is that if you're not sure that, if you think you know things for sure, then there's actually no reason to ever commission any new research. Right? Because if we actually know the elasticity of labor supply to tax policy, and if we know, you know, exactly what Obamacare will do, you just say, okay, we just solve our optimization problem, we're done. We never have to commission any new analysis, right? So, that's a bad effect, right? Not just for us, the scientists who want to do research, but I think it's bad for society. It also eliminates, if you think you know things for sure, then you don't think about maintaining flexibility in policy. Right? You don't think, I mean, as I think we should in general, that we should try things and then adapt as we get new information. And you don't have, this is not a matter of deep uncertainty versus standard expected utility Bayesian. I think the Bayesian framework is very nice for thinking about the value of information. The whole dynamic programming literature is about sequential gathering of information and interpreting it from a Bayesian perspective. But it makes that point very, very well, that sometimes you want to maintain flexibility. So if you think, if the policymaker's thinking we're just going to go as if we know the truth, you're never going to think about maintaining flexibility. And then the other one that I pushed hard in my own formal work is the notion of diversification, which is that in cases, this will not work for climate change. You cannot diversify climate change policy. It's the most macro possible policy, and we don't have multiple Earths to try one policy or the other, but we do have a whole range of more micro policies, which would be particularly like health and medicine, education, criminal justice policy, where if you forthrightly say we don't know what the best policy is, then you can diversify. You can apply one policy to some people and one policy to another, or to some geographic areas and so on. So if you can get into the policymaker's head that they should face up to uncertainty and not hide it. You know, if I only had 5 minutes, I would say that's the primary thing. And then, of course, the question is if you can get someone to sign on to that, then, of course, they would ask, well, how can we deal with uncertainty? And then I would, it was going to take a somewhat, maybe more than the average politician, maybe someone with nuance, because I would have to say to them that there's no single right way to do it. Because if you do face up to uncertainty, and this is true even in risk, even the most basic kinds of uncertainty, you're not certain what's right. It depends on the state of the world, and it may be that that this policy is best, or that policy A is best, or policy B is best, and you're not sure, and then it's inevitable that you're going to have to somehow trade off how, what. Well, I mean, the basic points would be easy to make. You could say there's a probability of an error. In basic statistics, people talk about a type 1 or a type 2 error. Type 1 error means you think policy A is best, but actually, the policy A really is best, or treatment A, but you mistakenly assume the treatment B is best, and vice versa. So those are type 1 and type 2 errors. And then you care about the losses if you make a mistake. What's the magnitude of the loss? And if you could get into the policymaker's head the idea that there will be, positive chance of losses, and or that you're wrong. It is possible that you're wrong in one direction or another, and then to get them to think about the magnitude of the losses they might suffer if they're wrong in one way or another. I think if they capture those two things, first that there is uncertainty, and then to have this notion of the different losses with different decisions, and that's probably 90% there, relative to where we are now. At that point, even though I personally prefer to think about things as under ambiguity, and I do minimax regret analysis and maximum analysis and that kind of thing, at that point, I'd be very happy if the policymaker became Bayesian. Yeah, at that point, because that would be such a change from current practice.
So we've talked about what your field has to say about what your field has to say about severe uncertainty in decision making. And just in the last 5 minutes, I'd like to turn to where you think it should go. So what I'd like to ask is what in your view are the central challenges for development of a proper account, or the application of a proper account, where you feel the central challenges are today?
Well, I think what's most on my mind is not so much on the theory, but just to see the kinds of ideas that I've expressed being applied. And it's not just politicians who aren't applying them; it's most empirical, applied economists are stuck with the incredible certitude, and so I think it's there's a lot of resistance to thinking about uncertainty at all, even as a probability, as a single probability, precise probability distribution, never mind a set of distributions. So what I see in the short run is moving people away from that. Now there's some progress. I've had various students, and they've had students, and things get around and articles get published. But if you look at the mainstream economics journals, the kind of work that I like to do, and I've done empirical analysis myself, and of course other people do in other areas, it's no more than 5%, at most, of what actually gets published.
So what sort of things do you think could help break down the resistance, or speed up the breakdown of resistance, both in the field and in application beyond?
I'll take a sociological or social interactions perspective on this. I don't think there's any good reason for things. If you look at the way things are, I don't think where people just routinely act as if they know much more than they do and make much stronger policy claims than are warranted. I don't think there's any good scientific or professional reason for that. But I think it's an equilibrium. People do it, and everyone else does it, and that's the norm. And so I'd think of this more in game theoretic terms formally as a situation with multiple equilibria, where we're in an equilibria where this is the way you do things and this is the way you get published. And one of the issues that shows up routinely, and people of course react to incentives. There are incentives to keep doing things that way, and so they keep doing it, right? So there's some stability to that equilibrium. Around lunch, when we were just talking about problems with the journals, not just me, but our colleagues are always talking about so-and-so wrote a great paper, it was executed very, very well, but the results were not startling. And, or they weren't going to draw much attention just because they had done it well. And so there was some ambiguity in what the findings. And the referee said, or the editor said, this isn't interesting, and then rejects the paper. And we all say to each other, that's wrong, right? That's wrong. That if a study is well executed, then it should be published, and the results come out however they are. But it turns out the stuff that gets published is the stuff that looks sexy with these kind of strong findings. And that norm could be changed, right? The norm, but it requires a discontinuous switch from one equilibrium to another. And it could be that you really, if you really do think about it, and it's a dynamic game, that you need to move things enough away from this bad equilibrium so that you enter the domain of attraction of a better equilibrium. That's actually how I view it. It's also the way I view it with politicians, even, is that politicians routinely, at least American politicians, say they don't want to hear about uncertainty. And I've quoted various people, they say, I just don't want to go near it. But if the norm could switch where a politician, where if people thought, well, if someone's making this really strong claim and not backing it up, then you should be really skeptical. And then the politicians, their incentives would switch so that they would want to acknowledge the uncertainty. But that would require a change in the equilibrium.
Charles Manski, thank you very much.
Thank you.